morning and welcome to Real Life. Why don't you go ahead and stand? We're going to start this time of praise and worship together.
When all I see is the battle, you see my victory. When all I see is a mountain, you see a mountain. And as I walk through the shadow,
is what we choose today. God, that regardless of the things going on in our life, God, regardless of the goods, regardless of the bads, God, today we make that choice. Today we make that choice to stand firm in who you are, God. To stand firm in our convictions, God. And to stand firm on the truth of your love and your grace and your mercy, Jesus. God, we choose that today. As we spend a few moments here, just between you and God this morning, as we sang, sometimes we have to choose to sing through those things. Sometimes we have to choose to lift our arms and to lift our voices and to step into that vulnerable place of worship. And whatever's happened in your past, whatever's happened this week, those things don't matter, because we serve a God who loves us. We serve a God who's forgiving. And we serve a God who, when he looks at you, he sees you for who he created you to be. So as we spend some time here this morning, whatever it is that's weighing you down today, whatever it is that you feel like might be keeping you from stepping into that deeper relationship with Christ, whatever it is that maybe you need to forgive yourself for this morning, let's spend some time here. Spend some time here with him and just give it to him today. We're going to be introducing a new song this morning, and it's called Greater Still. And the words are, my sin was deep, your grace was deeper. My shame was wide, your arms are wider. My guilt was great, your love was greater still. Again, that regardless of where we come from, regardless of what we think of ourselves, regardless of how we let our past define us, we serve a God who loves us greater than those things. So before we move into this last song, I just want to spend a few moments lifting those up, the people that we love and care about that need that reminder today. That their past doesn't define them, that that's not who they are, that there is a loving God who is so much greater than those things. Let's lift these names up to our God this morning.
You saw me at my very worst, when I expected disappointment. Love was all I heard. My sin was deep, your grace was deeper. My shame was wide, your arms were wider. My guilt was great, your love was greater still. You ran to me when I was naked. You clothed me in your righteousness. You pulled me from the depths of darkness into your light again. Oh, into your light again. My sin was deep, your grace was deeper. My shame was wide, your arms were wider. My guilt was great, your love was greater still. My sin was deep, your grace was deeper. My shame was wide, your arms were wider. My guilt was great, your love was greater still. How deep, how wide, how far, how high, the love of my Savior, the love of Christ. How deep, how wide, how far, how high, the love of my Savior, the love of Christ. How deep, how wide, how far, how high, the love of my Savior, the love of Christ. Yeah, my sin was deep, your grace was deeper. My shame was wide, your arms were wider. My guilt was great, your love was greater still. Yeah, your love, yeah, your love. My sin was deep, your grace was deeper. My shame was wide, your arms were wider. My guilt was great, your love was greater still. How deep, how wide, how far, how high, the love of my Savior, the love of Christ. How deep, how wide, how far, how high, the love of my Savior, the love of Christ. 'Cause my sin was deep, your grace was deeper. My shame was wide, your arms were wider. My guilt was great, your love was greater still. Your love was greater still.
Yes, God, your love is greater. God, that no matter what we hold on to, no matter what we bring, no matter what weighs us down, God, that your love can overcome every single one of those things. God, whether it's sickness, mental health, God, decisions that we've made. God, you are bigger than those things. And we thank you so much for sending your son to die on the cross so that we could have the opportunity to experience the love and the greatness that you are, Jesus. God, we thank you for meeting us here today. We thank you for your presence. In your name we pray. Amen.
Good morning, Real Life. It's good to worship together. I just have a couple announcements going on, but I first want to pull your attention to the blue card, that connection card that you got when you came in. It's just one way that we try to stay connected better together. There's a spot about on the blue area about getting more involved with things. So if there's something like, hey, like kind of figuring out your fall schedule, like I got some time to get involved. We'd love for you to get involved with what's going on check one of those boxes throughout the week, someone will get a hold of you. Also on the back side is a place for prayer requests. Every Monday morning, the staff gets together and prays over what's going on in your life. So there's something going on that you want to share with us. As a pastor, is one way that I love to be able to be involved in your life is to be able to pray for you. It's amazing how many hard things are going on. Just even last week, how many people had either they were going through something that was deeply medical, or they had a family member or a friend that was going through something that was very tragic. There's a lot of pain that happens in our lives. And so for us as a staff, like one thing we can do is walk alongside you and pray for you, what's going on there. So you can do that. These connection cards and also your tithes and offerings, there's a few ways that you can give if you don't want to give through like a check or something like that. There's on the screen there. But you can put the connection card and your tithes and offerings in the box in the back as you head out. So it's a couple things going on. Today, after our second service, about 11:45, we have our Intro to Real Life class. And so what it is a class for us. It's a kind of, for you to get to know some of the staff, get to know who we are, get to know some faces, as well as kind of like the basics of what real life is. We don't go really in depth. I was talking with Kelly, and in his previous church, he had to teach like an 8-week course on church stuff when it comes to it. It's just 1 hour. We provide lunch. It's pretty laid back. And so it's a good place for you to come listen, and then you're also welcome to ask questions about who we are as a church and why do we do what we do. If you have not signed up for it, it's okay. We get extra food. So just come back at 11:45, and we'll be meeting in the multi-purpose room down the back hallway there. The other thing we have going on starting tomorrow is a new home group launch. And so as a church, our home groups are very important to us. We should not do this Christian faith alone. And I would even say, like, you might come Sunday morning, sitting in a seat, you're doing it alone. It's really hard to interact with people. It's not a place where you really share what's going on in your life, what's difficult, what you're wrestling with. Like, you need a place to do that. You need a place where you have people around you that support you. When you're going through something great, they celebrate with you. When you're going through something difficult, they're there to mourn with you. You need people. And so what we do is, in the fall, we do a home group launch. So everybody that comes is new. So it's not like you're joining a bunch of people that already know each other. So Corbin would really love it if you use the QR code in your bulletin to register, just so he knows how many people are coming tomorrow. So it starts at 6, goes 6 to 8. There's childcare for this first week here at the church. So you can come here tomorrow at 6, and you can get involved in one of our home groups. And then the last announcement I have is we are going to do a baptism service next Sunday at the end of the second service. So we have some people getting baptized lined up, but we just want to open it up. If you feel like God's tugging in your heart, like this is the next step in your faith, to show to people around you, like, hey, I'm dedicated to the Lord, I'm dedicated to Christ. We see in the Bible, immersion is something that we see when people dedicate their life to Christ. And so if you want to take this next step in that, the best thing you can do is just write it in your connection card to say, hey, I want to get baptized this next Sunday. One of the staff will call you, we'll talk to you, and we'll get it lined up. So if you want to do that, go ahead and fill that out on your connection card. Before Kelly comes up to continue our series, we would love for you to stand up and say hi to someone around you, and then Kelly will come on up.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning. Welcome to Real Life Church. I'm Pastor Kelly. I get to be one of the shepherds here at this beautiful community, and I'm excited to continue our next series. But before I do, or our next sermon in our series, but before I do, I want to just do a quick shout out. Ann Sergey made it to Pakistan. I don't know if you guys follow on Facebook or not. Yes. So she made it to Pakistan, and she's with the community there that we're helping financially, and I know she was able to raise quite a bit for this mission trip and to be able to help the people there in Pakistan. So I wanted to give you guys an update on where she was at, and everything seems to be going really well. So she seems to be doing well there. So thank you again, and continue to pray for her as she is in the trenches there in Pakistan. I think she recently just got to visit some of the wreckage from some of the churches in there that were burned during the last round of upheaval. And so be praying for her through that. But I have a message today that is a tough one to give. A lot of times when I am preparing these sermons and going through these things, the Lord makes me go through a lot of it first, which is always good, but kind of hurts sometimes too, especially when it's messages like this. And what we're doing in this series is really focusing on what it means to shape and be intentional with church culture. How do we form a culture of goodness within this community? A goodness that pursues the goodness of God and is rooted in the fact that God is good. And so we're looking at different values every single week that help us kind of have direction as far as how do we pursue these things. What is the North Star? What are we keeping our eyes on? That is Jesus, but also the values and goodness of what he gives by being close to him. And so this first one we're looking at this week is we resist narcissism and value empathy. We resist narcissism and value empathy. And I think you're going to understand why going through this, why this was such an interesting message for me to try to develop and build, because there was a lot of self-reflection that happened this last week as I went through this. And it was a good sharpening and informing time for me, and I hope it is for you as we dive into this. But let me first start off by going into a little Greek mythology. It's probably the only time you'll ever hear me do this. There's someone say nice out there? All right. Cool. I'm in a good crowd. There was a man by the name of Narcissus, and he was a very good-looking man. The Brad Pitt of his days, I guess. I don't know. And Narcissus had a problem. Narcissus wouldn't allow anybody to really love him. He wandered around the world, and as people tried to get close to him, he would often reject them. And he would kind of have an attitude that he was far greater and far better than most. Well, one day he runs into a pond, as I have listed here on the images. And he's looking into the reflection, and he falls in love with his own reflection. He falls in love with himself, and as he moves, the reflection moves, he goes and he tries to hug it, and it breaks up, and it ripples in the water, and he ends up actually dying and becoming a flower, and there's this huge mythology around it. But he actually, it's the ability of what he fell in love with actually ends up being his downfall, which was himself. He couldn't stop looking at himself. The only thing that satisfied him was the love of self. The tragedy of Narcissus was that he decided to not love anyone outside of himself. So as the ancient world looked at the story of Narcissus, they said the tragedy of this man was he decided not to love anyone outside of himself. In fact, some would say he was actually incapable of loving someone outside of himself. The tragedy of Narcissus. This is where we get the word narcissist from. The tragedy of not being able to love anyone outside of yourself. And as we look at the current psychology of what it looks like to be a narcissist, it's a complex psychosis, I guess. It's very complex, and what we've learned over the years is that it's a bit on a spectrum, where you have some who are very high on one side and some who are more on the lower side. And I think if you look at our culture here in the States, it's pretty simple to think and to really reflect that we probably land somewhere on this spectrum. That every single one of us lands somewhere on this spectrum, whether it be on this side or this side. In fact, it may change depending on the day. But what we're learning as well is that it's a concept and it is a result of environment. That a lot of times it's the cultures around us that will create this self-important, self-loving type of a narcissistic tendency. You look at the age of social media. You know, we've seen, or scientists have seen, an 80% increase in narcissistic tendencies with the birth of social media. I don't think it's difficult to see why that's the case. When you're putting out there that everything is me, look at me, look at me. In fact, they ask the question most often is, how important do you think you are? That's how they rate a lot of the spectrum here, is how important do you think you are? With 80% people saying, I'm very important. That number used to be 30% in the 60s. So you can see with the birth of social media, a rapid change with how people view themselves. This means a lot of times it's a learned behavior, I think, is what most scientists are going through. You'll read different things, and trust me, I read a lot of stuff this week about it, which is very fun to read. But, you know, I think what most scientists and psychologists are looking at now is that it's a product of environment, it's a learned behavior, it's a coping mechanism for a lot of us and how we survive, how we react to things. It's done mainly within relationship. How are people perceiving me? How do I react in certain situations and things? So it's a lot of times it's through relationship, experience, through culture, that an unhealthy obsession with self is learned. And as we see this type of obsession with self begin to draw itself into the church, I think it's not hard to see kind of on the big C church level how we get these tendencies and we champion them in a lot of our cultures. The people who have power, the people who can really speak authoritatively, the people that seem to have it all put together. Right? These are all kind of stereotypes of sometimes what the outside world thinks of Christians, right? They're these judgmental, stereotypical people who kind of have everything put together. How many of you know that's not you? And that's not me, right? So we're going to look at how we can resist that. How do we resist the concept of narcissism as a people, something we're also going to struggle with, everything we have struggled with, we will struggle with, and how do we value empathy? Because the valuing of empathy as a group of people is how we can collectively and individually resist the temptations of being a unhealthy, obsessive people about what we desire, what we think is right, what we want over those around us, and the needs and wounds of the people around us. So let's look at, there's actually a great passage that Paul highlights where we actually see narcissism in the Bible. There's actually quite a few places if you looked, but Paul has a good way of really ripping this out. And as you read this, as I read this to you, I don't want you to think about the people around you who might be doing this. Okay? The temptation to read these oftentimes goes, I really wish my neighbor was here to listen to this. Okay? That's the opposite, again, what we're trying to do here, right? This is a time of self-reflection, a time to literally go, okay, Lord, what do you want to speak to me? And I'm not going to remind my spouse as I'll drive home that this is what they do today. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to look at 2 Timothy 3, 2 through 4. And let me just read this to you. You can follow along. Paul writes, for people will be lovers of self, philotos, lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, proud, demeaning, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, without love what is good. There's the tov there. There's the goodness that we're talking about. Traitors, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to the form of godliness but denying its power. Paul says, avoid these people. Avoid these people. In the context of this passage, he's writing to a young shepherd within the church of Ephesus, and he's actually speaking of certain people who are bringing in and deceiving people within the church. Mainly the lady folk of the church are being swayed by actually two names. Hymenaeus and Alexander are the names that Paul gives us in these passages. But he's also highlighting the importance of what kind of obsession with self leads to things that are harmful, destructive to a community, to an individual. And he uses the word philotas as lovers of self. And I think of this as kind of umbrellaing the rest of the passage. He starts with the idea of lover of self. Philotas brings about this unhealthy obsession with money, this boastful attitude, this proud, demeaning attitude. And I think that's what happens if we become self-obsessed. Philotas, as the Greek word for it, lovers of self. It brings about a fruit that is extremely toxic to our relationships, to ourselves, to the people around us. Think about this: slanderers, brutality, without love for what is actually good, denying its power. Paul says there are people that you're going to have to just avoid entirely because of the ramifications of what this means in your life and the life of the body. Which I think when I first read that, I was like, wait, Paul wants us to avoid people? I thought we were supposed to just love everybody. Right? Just go into everybody and say, hey, I don't care how you treat me. I'm supposed to go to you. But I think there's Paul is saying, hey, there's people, especially young Timothy and the people of church, there's people you just cannot be around. And this is an important truth I think you really have to get a hold of. There are people who are going to be so full of philotos that it's unhealthy to even be around them. That there's influence there, that there's oppression there, that there's unhealthy and toxic traits, that are going to bring about destruction. It's the reason it's the first list in this, or first item in this list, because it sprouts so many toxic behaviors. And the biggest one to me was that there is no love for what is tov. There is no love for what is good in this type of behavior, in this type of attitude of philotos. This is the type of thing that we are trying to resist as a community, as individuals within a community. How do we resist the temptations to put ourselves above others? How to resist the temptations to put our desires, our wants, our needs before those who are around us. But then also, how do we have the discernment to go, I should not stay in this relationship. I should not stay because the influence and the things that they're desiring of me, I cannot achieve, and it's breaking me. And I'm not actually thriving within what the Lord wants for me. It's interesting that he uses the word philautos because there in Greek we actually have two ways of saying this word. We have philautos, which is the negative connotation, the narcissistic type of connotation. But then there's phileton. Phileton, it's more of the good sense of self-love. And if you look at philotos, it's really the way of you only value yourself, is the way that Paul is saying this. You only value yourself. Whereas phileton means you know your value. Phileton is the Greek word for knowing your value. That's a healthy way of looking at self. Do you recognize and realize that you have value? That when the Lord looks at you, he says, yes, you were worth dying for. That when he created you, he said, yes, you were made in the image of God. You are my representatives in creation. That is a pretty high value in this world, is it not? To say that because you were made in the image of God, that you walk in the representative of God in this creation. That's how he formed it. It's how he wanted you to function. And so it's important to understand philotos versus phileton, because so often what we do especially I think in our society, is we do what's called splitting. Splitting, where we say either someone is all bad or they're all good. It's really black and white. So if you did this, you are all bad. If you did this, then you're all good. Right? What we realize is humanity is a lot more complex than that, isn't it? Humanity is much more complex than that. And so what we're seeing here is this idea of know your self-respect, know who you are and how God created you to be, know your value, but also know that you need to resist some things. That there are things that you're going to have to go to the Lord about and say, I am really struggling with philetos. I am really struggling with putting myself before others. I am really struggling with not being domineering and oppressive to people in my life. Does that mean you do not have phileton? Absolutely not. You still have incredible value. You still were one of those people that Jesus went to the cross to die for. It's not this black and white thing. It's really a complex issue, but you need to be able to resist the self-harm and self-love of philetos, but also embrace the self-love and self-respect of Phileton. Know your value, but do not only value yourself. If you love what is good, the idea of tov, because you see the value God placed in you and others. The value of empathy begins by looking at another human being and being able to look at them and go, you are a value. Despite everything they've done, despite their background, despite their history, but despite everything you've done, and to be able to still look at them and go, you still have value. You know, when I would talk to people who were struggling with narcissism, especially leaders, I've known a few in my day. The hardest part for them to see is, one, to recognize it, because usually it's everyone else's fault, right? But one, to recognize, but once they do recognize it, all they want to do is see that they have no more value, because their value was in how they looked at themselves. Their value was in looking at the pawn like Narcissus and seeing this is what it means to be satisfied. And when they're forced to not be able to look at themselves in the pawn, they start to realize, they think that they don't have any value, but they do not realize that God has put a value within them by being made in the image of God, just for one of those. So we resist narcissism by valuing empathy and compassion. My dream for this place is that we be a place that values empathy and compassion. Empathy and compassion. The definition of empathy is this: the action of understanding. Say that, understanding. Being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of others. You know, what's crazy is I've heard pastors from pulpits actually preach that empathy is a sin. I have never, that is a weird concept to me, but I've heard it. It's out there. It's in the internets. Okay? So which means probably a lot of people listen to that. But really, empathy is one of the most basic things and really encompassed who Jesus was. The action of understanding somebody. Being aware, being sensitive to, and experiencing what they're going through is the act of empathy. If narcissism is a lover of self, the opposite of that is a person who values that and seeks to understand and act on behalf of others. The value of understanding where somebody is and then acting on it, that's the compassion piece. Compassion is the action of working out mercy on behalf of empathy, what you just received. And so as a people, we must first seek to understand before we try to be understood. We must first seek to understand before we try to be understood. And so this takes a whole lot of not talking, which is tough. Okay, how many of you have opinions? All of us have opinions. All of us have, hey, this is what we should do. This is what I think we should do. We all do that. I do that probably worse than anybody. And it's really hard to be able to sit there sometimes and just try to meet somebody where they are. Because my experience is most people aren't looking for advice. Most people are just looking for a safe place to speak. Just looking for somebody who will understand them. Somebody who will sit there and go, I know where you're at. I get it. I know what you're feeling. I've been there. They're looking for someone who will just confirm where they're at, to validate where they are at that place. We see value in meeting people where they are. That no matter where you are at as an individual, as you are collectively as a family, whatever it is, our goal is to try to get to where you are and meet you there, not try to get you 10 steps ahead. There is so much value in being able to sit with somebody who is grieving and mourning and brokenness and toxicity, whatever it is, and be able just to sit there with them. The best counseling sessions I've ever had with people are where I don't speak, where I just get to sit with them and listen to them, doing my best to try to meet them where they are. And Jesus' empathy was was pretty easily seen. One of the best ways to look at it, and I think one of my favorite passages, maybe in all of the book of John, is in John 11, verses 32 through 37, the story of Lazarus. He says in verse 32, as soon as Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, this is after the death of Lazarus, she fell at his feet and told him, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Imagine the emotion that she must have been at. Where were you, God? Where were you, Lord? If you would have been here, this bad thing wouldn't have happened. I've had that conversation with him before. Where were you, Lord? Where were you when this person was hurting me? Where were you when I was making these terrible mistakes? Where were you, Lord, when my niece passed away? I've had all these conversations before. When Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews who had come were crying, he was deeply moved. And this word also has the connotation of like the drawing up of anger, which is an interesting way of looking at it. He wasn't angry that they were crying, like, have some faith. He wasn't, that wasn't his demeanor. He's like, do you know who I am? Like, I'll fix this. No, that wasn't him at all. He was angry with the concept of death. He was angry that this creation he had to be broken. He was angry and moved because of their tears and where they were at with it all. He saw somebody who was extremely broken by the loss of their brother, at the loss of their friend as a valued member of the community, and it troubled him. It deeply moved his spirit. This is empathy. This is being able to see somebody in their brokenness and go, oh, it stirs up to me emotion. That stirs in me the fact that I want to act on this person's behalf. But you can't get there if you're not meeting them in the brokenness, in the sadness, in the grieving. You haven't earned the right to do that yet. So he asks, where have you put him? He goes, in the shortest verse in all of Scripture, Jesus wept. He cried along with them. He cried along with them at the grave of Lazarus. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them also said, couldn't he just open the blind man's eye? Or couldn't he who opened the blind man's eyes also have kept this man from dying? Why is he showing empathy? He could have saved him. He could have stopped everything from happening. Jesus was more enthralled in meeting people where they are than what their expectations were of him. Your relationship with Jesus will change when you recognize how much he's willing to walk with you, where he's willing to let you go so that he can be there with you. I mean, I've been in some dark holes in my life, and the fact that he was like, I'm going to allow this to happen so that I can meet you there so that you will actually get closer to me is phenomenal. The fact that he will do that he will say, I'm going to let this happen so that I can get close to you. Because every single time I've gone through a hard time, every moment, every time I've had to have a hard conversation, every time I've faced rejection, whatever it is, I have walked out of those times closer to the Lord than I was going into him. The Lord knew that he was going to raise Lazarus. He had the solution. He wasn't worried about that. What's highlighted here is what's highlighted here is that he's sitting with these people in empathy, which is going to lead him to compassion and the raising of Lazarus. The raising of Lazarus was a compassionate move. Lazarus probably got the wrong end of the straw on that, to be honest with you. He was probably in his golden mansion going, hey, let's do this. All of a sudden, he's back on earth. He had compassion for those who he showed empathy to. He cried with them. He understood their pain experience. It drove him to anger even, the fact that they had to experience this, that his creation was so broken that death was to be experienced. He emphasized with its effects. He emphasized with the fact that he knew very one day he was going to conquer death, yet he still empathized with the effects of it. It was empathy that was met with compassion. And that's our model. That's who we are to represent in this world, are people who meet people where they are, empathize with them, meet them emotionally, understand them, validate them, recognize, acknowledge the truth of where they're at, and then be able to meet them with compassion, whatever that looks like. Now, there is some, let me go through, I guess, empathic listening, because there are also some warning signs I need to make sure we have balance with empathy. But let's talk about empathic listening a little bit, and how do we actually listen with empathy? Because I think, like I said before, we really have to earn the right to minister to someone. I really believe that. Like me coming in here and saying, I'm your pastor, now I have to listen to you is not very good. Like, I have to earn the right to minister to you. Like, there are times when I won't speak to somebody here in this church because I haven't felt like I have the right to really speak into their life yet. I haven't really listened to them enough to be able to meet them where they are. So I'll just let them talk. It's okay to not have to bring correction to every single person in your life. It's okay not to have an answer for every person who is struggling in your life. Sometimes it's okay to just sit and listen and go, I don't know if I have the right to minister to this person yet. I haven't built relationship enough with this person yet. I haven't really been able to meet with them with empathy yet. Too often we try to minister to them based off of position or our age or what we've been through before and those types of things, and we just completely overlook the importance of empathy. As Christians, again, we have a common stereotype of being judgmental, overcritical. We just never really learned how to listen correctly. We just never really got to understand the importance and benefit of being a people who listen rather than being a people who are always talking. And I think what we have the opportunity of here is to be a group of people who collectively value listening, understand how to do it well, because this will influence our greater cultures. I mean, this is something that the whole world is thinking about right now. If you walked into any business environment, secular world right now, they're going, how do we listen to people? How do we listen to our customers? How do we listen to our students? How do we listen to our employees? This is a huge thing because everyone's recognizing how completely disastrous not listening is. And the church, I believe, really should be the leaders in how we listen well. Because we've done a lot of years of talking. And I think it's time for us to now listen. So how do we listen well? It goes back to trying to understand before attempting to be understood. So here's some tips. Tips for emphatic listening. You guys ready? Tip number 1, it's not about you. Tell it to yourself when you're listening to them. It's not about me. It's about what this other person is going through. Okay, it's not about you. You were there to meet them where they're at, not for you to try to get them where you are. Okay? It's not about you. Part 2, put your phone away. Some of you are like, ooh. Put your phone away. Okay, when you have your phones out, a lot of times when you're in conversation, it kind of shows you that this is more important than this. Okay? This is something I struggle with. Because I'm always like, what's the email? What's that text? Oh, and so for a lot of times, I sometimes have to put them in another room. Just get them out of there. Okay? Put your phone away. Validate that they're important to you. Okay? When your phone's out, it says that they're secondary in the room. Okay? 3, refrain from criticism. Refrain from criticism. Respect their authenticity and their vulnerability. Because you're going to hear some weird stuff when you do this. And it's important not to make sure your facial features are not like, huh. Okay? That says a whole different thing. All right? Refrain from criticism. Make eye contact. Nod your head. That must have been really hard. Man, I can't even imagine what that would be like. Right? What you're doing is you're refraining from criticism, allowing them to share with authenticity and vulnerability where they're at. Again, this is half the battle, is just letting them do this. Next one is ask open-ended questions. Ask open-ended questions. How did that make you feel? Tell me more about that. Are good ways to kind of introduce that. Tell me more about your situation. Allow them to continue on conversing. This says that you care, that you want to learn more, that you care about what they're having to say. Now, okay, let me tell you 10 things to fix this. All right, first off, that doesn't work. Next one, stop giving unsolicited advice. Stop giving unsolicited advice. Sometimes the greatest healing is just being there for someone. So a lot of times, if at the end of once they're kind of coming off of their talking time, you can kind of see it ramping up. I'll ask them, I'll say, hey, are you okay if I give you some advice? Or are you open to me helping in one way or another? So it's a lot of times, sometimes you just ask permission to be able to speak into someone's life. Like when I first got here, a lot of times I had to tell people, hey, you have permission to speak hard things into my life. Like if you see me doing something, I want you to call me out on it. I want you to not let it just go by, pretending somebody else will say something. Like sometimes you have to just be very clear about what your expectations are. Okay? So if you're talking to somebody, say, hey, like, am I okay to give you this advice? Because some people will say, I just want to talk, or I just needed to talk to you, or I just needed to share this one story. And you're like, great. And that was more helpful than any advice you could get. So stop giving unsolicited advice. And the last one, don't fill up the silence. Don't fill up the silence, because oftentimes the Spirit is working in the silence. I've sat in rooms and haven't spoken for a minute, just watching the Lord work on somebody. It's amazing when people walk out in those silent times and they go, wow, that was an incredible time together. I'm like, I didn't say a word. I'm glad you thought it was great. I was probably playing something in my head half the time. I tell you, this was convicting to me too. I do not do this 100% well. In fact, I think it's funny how even through the week, like Amy and I would get in like a conversing argument, and then I'm just like thinking about this. I'm like, yep, did not listen to that. So again, this is, as I said last week, we're here to get it right, but we're not always going to be right, okay? This is direction we're headed, but we're not always going to get this right on the nail. So those are my tips to being able to listen with empathy. So by listening and actively working to understand someone, we earn the right to show compassion to them. This is really what we're trying to get to. We're meeting where they are, but we really are going to go, how can I earn the right to give this person compassion, to meet them where they're at? You know, Jesus was notorious for showing empathy and compassion to the wrong people. You know, the Pharisees used to have just upheavals over Jesus sitting with sinners and tax collectors. Being able to sit there with somebody, like, you're not supposed to be nice to those people. And sinners in those days was a classification. It wasn't just like I'm a sinner. It was a classification of people. These were your worst of your worst within societies, culturally. And that's who Jesus would sit with. And those were the people who were transformed by him, were the people who sat with Jesus, where he showed them compassion, where he met them where they were. Despite their rejection from society, he met them where they were so that he could meet them and then show compassion to them. Now here's a warning about empathic listening, because again, there are things where Paul's like, hey, avoid these. Avoid these people. We need balance here, because I'm a bit of an empath just generally. And so I also have to understand there's a balance there, because I will get chewed up and spit out sometimes if I'm not careful. There's a reason why 2 Timothy 3:4, Paul says to avoid these philautos. One, it's okay to recognize that relationships that you're in are harmful and unhealthy. It's okay. Some people left churches because they recognize the unhealthiness and harmfulness of the church. That is okay. That's why good culture should try to be shaped and formed so we do not do those types of things. And I always think of an oxygen mask. Amy taught me this. She says, anytime you're working with somebody, this is like a financial thing or emotional thing or a spiritual thing, make sure that your oxygen mask is on first. Make sure that you can breathe before you're going to start pouring out into someone else's life. It's like when you get onto an airplane and they say, hey, make sure your mask is on before the person next to your's mask is on, because if you pass out and faint, you're not going to be any help to this person. And it's the same thing when we think about emphatic listening. You have to make sure that your emotional health is in a good place. Your spiritual health is in a good place before you ever try to pour into somebody else. Because you will become, especially when you're dealing with people who are really strong on the narcissistic spectrum, that they will eat you up and spit you out. I have been eaten up and spit out before. Right? So we have to have balance here. There has to be an understanding and discernment of realizing that I'm being influenced more towards philautos than I am philauton. That when you're in relationships and your value is being completely destroyed, you're realizing should not be in this relationship. Make sure you have balance and that you are promoting healing rather than getting sick in the process. Okay, because again, empathic listening, you can really get sick by allowing those things to wear on you, and it really does bring about some unhealth. So have balance there, and have someone you can talk to. I have people that I talk to. I have people that I can go to and say, boy, I had a week. Let me just share with you my week, okay? Find people to talk to if you don't. All right, I'm going to end with this. So overall, empathic listening is about loving someone by showing them empathy so we can meet them with compassion. Now, one thing I do want to point out before I completely end, though, is when we show empathy and when we're listening, it doesn't mean we're affirming everything they say. I think sometimes we get a little confused by empathy and affirmation. Okay, so I can show you empathy, and I can meet you where you are by completely disagreeing with everything you're saying. I can validate you without agreeing with everything that you're saying. Because empathy does not mean affirmation. Empathy means I'm meeting somebody where they are and I'm listening to them and acknowledging that that's where they are. Do you guys see the difference here? Because so often you are going to run into people you disagree with. You are going to run into people who hate you. I mean, Jesus said that, right? And who did he say we were supposed to love? Those who hate us and persecute us, right? I think what Jesus would do is he would come down and he was like, how do I know about Kelly? I'm going to ask the people who don't agree with him who he is. I'm going to ask the people who don't like him what his character is like. What if the Lord came down and said, and talked to your neighbors and said, hey, what is this person like? How do they listen? How do they love? I don't think he would ask the people that are easy to love. He's going to ask the difficult people to love how we love. I think the churches in the world that are going to really just beam the light of Jesus are those who really love the people who hate them well and listen to the people who disagree with them well, but still using mercy and compassion to lead them to him. To the most hurting, abused, and broken people, the love they need from us is that we acknowledge their pain and we don't always affirm it. So one thing I want you to do this week as kind of a take-home exercise, and I think small groups are going to be touching on this as well. I want you to ask people in your sphere of influence, your relationships, your spouses, your friends, your kids, whatever it is, ask them this question: how do you experience me? What emotions, what feelings, what things come to mind when you have to talk to me about something? Because I've had people in my life who I just feel like if I got into a room with that person, I would be a nervous wreck. Ask the question and then don't say a word. Just listen to them. Meet them where they are by how they're expressing and explaining how they experience you in their life. These are not accusations. Take them as feedback. Okay, sometimes we don't know the difference between feedback and accusations. Take it as feedback. Take it as a place to go, okay, I'm going to listen to this person, I'm going to meet them where they are, and I'm going to learn how to show compassion to these people. So how do you experience me? And I'll end with this. Remember the words of Jesus our Lord. In Matthew 9:12 it says, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. Now go and learn what this means. I desire compassion rather than sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Amen. Let's take communion together. First, Jesus took the bread. You know, as we're contemplating, we're kind of self-reflecting this message, and hopefully you guys continue to self-reflect in the weeks to come. You know, we think about what Jesus has done, the compassion that was shown to us by his sacrifice on the cross. That he knew our thoughts, he knew our actions, he knew exactly who we were, our deepest desires, and those things still compelled him to go to the cross. The love that he had for us compelled him to go to the cross, to give us life, to give us a people, to allow us to be a people that represent him in this world. So as we take the body together, we are taking in the love, compassion of Christ. We are recognizing that we are part of his people, that we are to represent him. So this week, the challenge is this, is how well can we represent him by listening as a church? Let's take this together. In the cup, the symbol of his blood that was spilled for us. Again, remember the promise. I say this every week, I do this. Remember the promise that he is with us. Because in the times of hardship, when we have to look at the hard, look at the good, look at the messy, whatever it is, we need to remember that he is with us. There was nothing that he did not experience in this world that we did not also experience. That we have a high priest who understands what it means to be human. That we have a God who came in the flesh, Jesus Christ, who understood all of the hardships and difficulties and the brokenness of man. Yet he overcame those. And he promises to never leave us nor forsake us for all time. Let's take the drink together.
Would you please stand with us as we continue our time of worship?
I can't go back to the beginning. Can't control what tomorrow will bring. But I know here in the middle is the place where you promised to be. I'm not enough, oh, unless you come. Will you meet me here again? 'Cause all I want is all you are. Will you meet me here again? As I walk now through the valley, let your love rise above every fear. Like the sun shines shadows in my weakness, your glory appears. I'm not enough, oh, unless you come. Will you meet me here again?